When it comes to making tools for the blacksmith shop, there is a huge variety of steel available out there. Lots of different characteristics, lots of different alloys, and sometimes that can be really confusing for the new blacksmith. I'm John Switzer. Welcome back to Black Bear Forge. So today I'm going to take kind of a start from the beginning approach with some steel. I have picked up a piece of 1045. This is new steel. It's a known product. You can look it up in a book. You can figure out exactly how it should be hardened and tempered, exactly what temperature it forges at best. And that's really the way I suggest you start with making tools. While it can be really satisfying to make tools from salvage steel sometimes, there's a bit of a guessing game that goes on there, and you're more likely to have failures. And what you learn with one source of salvage steel might not apply to the next source. But if you're buying new steel and you use the same material over and over again, it won't be long before you really start to understand the characteristics of that material, and sometimes that works out way better than trying out a whole lot of different steels. Now, there's no secret, I like things like S7 and H13 for certain tools, and as your experience gains, you'll probably start experimenting with more tools. But when you're just starting out, sticking with that single type of steel can really help. Now, 1045 is nothing special. That's a simple carbon steel. It's a medium carbon steel. It only has 45 points of carbon. It is hardenable, but it's never going to get hard enough for a razor or a knife or something like that. Doesn't make bad hammers. I have never made punches and chisels from it before. This is an experiment. I'm going to see how this turns out. So don't rush right out and buy yourself a piece of 1045. I think this was $13 or $14 plus shipping, so it's really a much more affordable steel than some of those other really high-tech alloys are. Now, the other reason that I chose this is because it says harden in water or brine. And that means you don't have to have any special oils, you don't have to worry about fires caused by oils. So right there is a good argument for using 1045. Another possibility would be W1, which is also a pretty good steel, but it's so much higher in carbon that you may not want it for punches and chisels, depending on exactly how you use those tools. So what am I going to do with this? It's 36 inches long. I can get 4 9-inch pieces of material out of this. And for most of my handheld punches and chisels, I really do like 9 inches. It's a good length that keeps your hand away from the heat a little further and also keep it away from the struck end so you're less likely to accidentally hit your fingers if you have a bad blow with the hammer. Then I think I'm going to make 4 different tools out of this. I'm going to make a punch, a chisel, a center punch, and a V-fuller. And the reason for those 4 tools will be explained a little bit better in subsequent videos where we put those tools to some harder use to make sure that they actually hold up the way we want them to. These are cut 9 inches long, and the first step that I want to do is just put a little bit of a taper on the end here, just a little octagonal taper. Not super critical, but I think it does help a little bit to concentrate the blows and just makes for a cleaner looking tool. That just starts off as square, and then you go to a rough octagon. I'm not trying to make it a perfect octagon. It'll be a little bit bigger in the square dimension. Then the next thing I want to do is create a flat here. And the purpose of this flat is just to give you something you can grab for a chisel or something that you need to steer. That sure makes it a lot easier to control, because a round bar can be sometimes hard to index. So all 4 of these, even though some of them don't really matter that much, like the punch or the center punch, I still want to make all the grip areas the same. And to do that, I'll just put part of that over the edge of the anvil and forge that down. I want to bring all 4 of them to the same stage before I turn them around and do the working end. I think I'm going to do these one at a time so it's clearer in the video, but typically I would heat all 4 of these and just alternate and work them all kind of together, and that way I can take more advantage of the heat from the gas forge. I'm going to start with the center punch. I'm just going to taper the end out some. Oops. Now remember, this is hardenable steel and it's got a working range. This is definitely too cold to work, so back in the fire. I'm going to leave most of this octagonal and just round up the very end. And most of this end will be done on the grinder. That way I can get a more precise end than trying to forge a center punch entirely by hand. I'm going to bring this up to heat real lightly just to get a nice even heat. Then I'm going to set it aside and let it normalize. And while I do that, I'm going to start heating the next piece, which will be the round punch. So I am going to draw this out a little bit longer and forge it more precisely round. It'll still need to be ground at the end, but I'll get it as close as I can at the anvil. And I'm going for about a 5/16 round punch. So take your time and keep putting it back in the fire as you need to. And of course we're starting square, then going to octagon, and now I'm rounding it up. Now for the chisel, it's kind of important to keep the blade in line with this flat we created so it indexes better. That leaves the last one, and this is going to be a V-fuller, and I have a reason that I want to make a V-fuller, and we'll talk about that later. I'm going to start by upsetting the end of this just a little bit. Just like a little bit more mass there. You can either work it down on the anvil or you can turn it up and work it directly with the hammer. And I'm going to start forging a bevel while it's up like this. That's probably about all I'm going to do at the anvil. I did get this a little out of line. I let it twist. But because it's still round through here, I can go ahead and take it to the vise, twist it so it's in line, and it'll never show. This twisting wrench made from a pipe wrench works pretty well on round bar. Pretty good. Let's make sure all that looks nice and clean and straight after doing that. And then, like everything else, it'll be heat it up to nice even heat and let it normalize. So that's 4 tools forged out in pretty short order. There's definitely going to be some grinding to do, but if you let them normalize and relax a little bit, they'll be easier to grind. Actually, annealing them would even be better, and if you're going to hand file these because you don't have a power grinder, I would definitely take the time to anneal them, bury them in vermiculite, wood ash, something like that overnight, so that they cool as slowly as possible, and then they're a lot easier to hand file. My grinder doesn't really care that much, so normalizing them will be fine for that. I have let our set of 4 tools air cool and normalize, so the next thing I want to do is grind these. If you only have files, by all means file them. Hot filing or hot rasping might be a way to go. You can get a lot of material to move quite quickly doing it that way. And I will link to a video up here where we've discussed that technique before. And you can take a look at that if you want to know what hot rasping is all about. You can certainly cold file them, and if you're only using hand tools and you're hot rasping, I would still file them cold afterwards. You'll get a better finish that way. If you've got an angle grinder, that's going to make this a little bit faster. By all means, go ahead and do this with an angle grinder. If you've got a hard wheel motorized grinder, that's a good way to go. Takes a little bit longer than an angle grinder or a belt grinder, but it's certainly an option. Even an old-fashioned pedal grindstone would be an option if you have one of those. It really doesn't matter. Use the tools you have. Use the tools that you're comfortable with. I'm going to use a belt grinder because I have 3 belt grinders, and it makes my life so much easier to use the big belt grinders. And each tool needs to have a little bit different grind done to it because they're all different tools. I do want to dress the struck end a little bit to make sure there's not any sharp edges or something that might chip or encourage mushrooming. Put a little bit of bevel on that. And then we'll work on the working ends of these and make them into the tools that we want. Probably take them all down to a 220 grit finish. And then we will be ready to do some hardening and some tempering. The grinding process takes about 30 minutes, including setting up the grinder, changing belts, things like that. So it's really not too bad. And frankly, if I were doing all this by hand with hot rasping and filing, or even using a smaller grinder, I wouldn't grind so much. The as-forged finish is fine everywhere but the working end and the struck end. Grinding up the shaft like this just to make it a little bit smoother and cleaner is just aesthetics. I just did that because I've got the tools that'll do it. But if I were hand filing it, I probably wouldn't take it to that extent. Now, one of the handiest places there is to look up steel information is right on your mobile device, and I use the Heat Treat Guide Companion. It's an app. I think the app is free, doesn't cost you anything, and I find it really useful. We can go into the app and simply type 1045, and we can pull up the characteristics of the 1045 steel and see what it says. Well, most of this stuff is for people in industry, people that really need to know all the exact details. What I'm interested in is forging temperatures and hardening and tempering temperatures, and that is one place this falls a little short, is on the tempering temperatures. But normalizing is at 1650, annealing is at 1555, and hardening is at 1555. So this is one of those steels that when hardening just a little above non-magnetic probably works pretty well. A lot of those fancier alloys need to be a lot hotter than when they lose magnetism. So if you're using a magnet to tell when a steel's hot enough, that'll probably work on this. It doesn't work with things like H13 and S7. I'm just going to go ahead and do this in the gas forge because it's easier to get everything hot. It'll go just a little bit quicker. You can certainly do it in a coal forge. You can do, if you're just hardening the tips, which is one option, you can do it with a torch. If you're trying to do the entire tool, it's probably better if you go ahead and do it in a forge and get the whole thing hot. And certainly an electronic heat treat oven is going to give you the best results. So it's off to light the forge and get a nice clean bucket of water. You're much better off with fresh, clean water than you are with dirty water. It could change the way it hardens and tempers. And if you're trying to develop the best habits, clean water is a good habit to be in. I'm going to put these in struck in first to get a more even heat. And I'm going to let them soak with the forge off and then cycle the forge on and off as needed to bring them up nice and slowly to what I'm guessing by eye is 1555. Be careful about judging color based on what you see here on a video. Every camera interprets the color a little bit differently. The light in the shop can affect that. The editing software I use can affect the way the color comes out. And of course your computer and your monitor at home will affect the way the color comes out. So it may look completely different to you on whatever you're watching this on than what it looks to me. So it's something you just have to learn through experience. The heat is still just a little uneven, so they're non-magnetic in one area but not all the way up. I'd like a more even heat, so I'm going to let them soak just a little while longer. Then when you quench, try to move them up and down and around in a figure eight so that they quench very evenly. If you don't move it, air bubbles form on one side or the other, and then you get a real uneven quench, and that can contribute to warping. Although be careful if you're doing something thin, moving it side to side can also contribute to warping. So in that case, just vertically might be the best option. Go ahead and test this chisel and see how hard it got, and then also test the struck end and see if it's softer than the cutting end. It's good and hard on the cutting edge. Not hard at all on the struck end. So that should not hurt our hammer at all. If it mushrooms too much, that means I should have hardened it more, and that's just something we'll test as we put these to use. And they're all in here in the toaster oven, set to 450, and I'll leave them for 1 hour. It's still difficult to file, but a little bit softer, so I think our temper is very good. And the exact hardness isn't that important. It's going to be used on hot material, and it's way harder than the hot material. So a little bit of cleanup on the grinder. I'll do the final grinding on the tools that need it with a 60 grit belt. Then I'm going to move over to a 220 grit belt and do the final cleanup. They really don't need to be polished for blacksmithing tools. They're going to get beat up and banged up, and a quick cleanup and sharpening is all they ever need to use. Here is our set of 4 tools. We have a center punch, a round punch, a hot chisel, and a V-fuller. I chose this set of tools for a project that we'll look at in another video. I'm going to make some V-bit tongs, so I'll need to lay them out. I'll need to punch a hole for the rivet. We'll need to cut the material to length. And we will need to put the V-bit in, and I'm hoping that these are all of the supplemental tools that we will need for that project. And I'll try and do as much of that as I can at the anvil and not worry about power saws, hacksaws, grinders, drill presses, all that kind of stuff. So hopefully these are the tools that will take care of that. But it will also require some sort of a V-swedge to match the V-fuller. But let's give these a test. Let's see how these hold up, or at least how the punch and the chisel hold up. And we'll do just a little bit of hot work with them. One thing I'd be aware of is that because this is a simpler steel, it is not a hot work steel like H13 is, and even S7 has very good hot work capabilities. These will suffer if they get too hot. So keep a can of water handy and cool these frequently in use, and they should last a lifetime. Putting a center punch mark in here just to test the center punch. And with one punch, I can tell no difference in that. After a dozen or so, we'll see if that starts to deform, but it should be okay. These are still relatively hard tools, and working in mild steel and in hot steel, I really expect very good results from these. So we can definitely punch a hole. Now we can see that this is already tempered up into a blue range as a result of being in contact with the heat. And that's probably not going to hurt anything in the long run, but the hotter that gets, the softer it's going to get and the more temper you're going to draw in it. So try not to let it get too hot. This is probably considerably softer now, but still way harder than hot steel. I don't see any wearing of the edge on the chisel. It seems to be doing just fine. And we've cut all the way through a piece of 1/8 inch, so that does what it's supposed to do. The real test will be to see how long these things hold up, actually using them here in the shop. So we're going to do that V-bit tong project here in a few videos, and then we'll use these for various projects for a while. Then I'll have a better idea of how well these really hold up in use. But that brief test, I think there's good promise, and I think if you take care of them, if you keep them cool as you use them, if you redress them when they start to mushroom, and if reforge them if they start to bend, reharden and temper them if you have to. Lots of ways you can keep tools in good use, and you can get by with a lot less expensive material that's a lot easier to harden and temper. Good basic stuff. Getting real familiar with one steel might serve you way better than having a big assortment of steels in the shop that you really aren't sure exactly what you're supposed to do with. Now certainly these are not going to hold up as well under heat as the H13 or the S7 tools, but I think that's probably a worthwhile trade-off. And if you think about it, our predecessors in blacksmithing probably didn't have steel this nice, and they did some spectacular work. A lot of their tools are still in existence, they're still being used. I think I'll probably order some more of this and maybe make this into a set of a dozen tools, different size punch, different style of chisel maybe, just so I can become familiar with it and how you have to work with it to make the tools and what things you have to do when you're using them, like cooling them off really frequently to keep them in good shape. One thing I didn't do to these that I really should have, I usually take the time not only to put my touch mark on, which I forgot, but also to put what kind of steel it is. I try to stamp that into it so when I come back later, I know what these were. Don't get them confused with 4140 or H13 or S7 or 01 or W1 or any of those other steels, which again is a good reason to just use one steel, get familiar with it, and then you know what all your tools are. But because these have been hardened, I'm not going to take a stamp to them that's really hard on your touch mark or your stamp. You need to do it while it's hot, or at least while it's in an annealed state. And it's too late to do that, so I'm just going to put these somewhere. So I'll just put these somewhere else so I know what they are. If you would like to see ad-free versions of my videos, I'm making most of these videos available for certain levels of Patreon patrons. So check out my Patreon page. There's a link down in the video description on that if you're interested in seeing ad-free versions of the videos. If you enjoyed this video, by all means, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't done so already, I would love it if you hit that subscribe button down there. Feel free to stick around, watch a few of the other videos, share the videos with your friends, but then by all means, make time in your day to get out to your shop, make something. Stay safe, wear your safety glasses. We'll see you for the next one.